All right, everybody, I apologize. That last video got cut off. Unfortunately, whenever it storms, which it is right now at my house, I have very spotty internet connection. And so my internet went out, and therefore I have to start a new video. But that's okay, we can resume here. I was saying before that this table basically is just a summary of the key differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions in terms of their anatomical differences and their functional differences. Okay, so definitely take a look at this table whenever you're studying for the exam. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about each of the different divisions, and now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each of the divisions. So first we're going to cover the parasympathetic division, and then we'll cover sympathetic division. So as I mentioned before, the parasympathetic division is also called the craniosacral division. It contains very long preganglionic fibers that we can see in this dark purple color, which extend from the central nervous system until almost or sometimes at the target organs. And so in the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are going to synapse with the postganglionic neurons at what we call terminal ganglia. Okay, so the parasympathetic ganglia are called terminal ganglia. And these terminal ganglia are going to be located either close to or actually within the target organ. And at that point, we're gonna have very short postganglionic fibers, which synapse with whatever effector it's targeting. Okay, so again, just to kind of make this a little bit more, I guess, clear. These sections are the ones that I'm putting circles around. These are what we call the terminal ganglia. Okay, so that's just where basically the passing of the baton from the preganglionic to postganglionic neuron is occurring. Okay, and these are, again, they're called terminal ganglia in the parasympathetic division. Okay. So I just mentioned that the parasympathetic division has a cranial part and a sacral part, and you can also see that here we have the cranial part and the sacral part. And so let's go ahead and briefly talk about this cranial part first. So the cranial part is the one that we see up here, the top of this picture. And the cell bodies of the preganglionic fibers are going to be in the brainstem, which you can see. And the preganglionic fibers themselves actually run in 4 of the cranial nerves. So they're going to run in the oculomotor nerve, the facial nerve, so be abducens, and vagus nerve. Or I'm sorry, glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. Sorry, I'm like doing that in my head. So let's talk about first the oculomotor nerve. So the preganglionic fibers are going to run through the oculomotor nerve, where they are going to synapse onto the terminal ganglia. And in this particular case, the terminal ganglion is actually going to be what's called the ciliary ganglion. All right, so the name of this terminal ganglia is called the ciliary ganglion. And this is going to go on to control the smooth muscle of the eye It's also going to control the pupils, and that's going to cause the pupils to constrict, because remember, this is parasympathetic, so you know, smaller pupils. And this is also going to innervate the lens of the eye, which is basically the structure that bends light that's coming into our eye. And so this particular, in this particular case, the lens is going to bulge for focusing of close-up objects. From here, remember this ganglion, this is where the synapse from preganglionic to postganglionic fibers are occurring. And the postganglionic fibers are going to originate in these ciliary ganglia. And these ciliary ganglia are actually, so this particular diagram isn't exactly correct, but it just wants to give you kind of an understanding. The ciliary ganglion would actually be located sort of like within the orbit of the eye. Okay, so that's this first terminal ganglia connection here. The second part of the cranial part of the parasympathetic division is these preganglionic fibers that are coming out of the facial nerve. They are going to synapse in what's called the pterygopalatine ganglion. This is the terminal ganglion of this particular nerve, or they might also synapse in the submandibular ganglion. So the preganglionic fiber here that you can see coming off of the 7th cranial nerve is actually going to split two ways. One, it's going to connect to the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is going to send postganglionic fibers to innervate the nasal and the lacrimal glands. So the nasal glands and the tear glands. And the submandibular branch of the preganglionic fiber running through this cranial nerve is actually going to synapse onto its postganglionic fiber here in the submandibular ganglion, which will go on to innervate the submandibular and sublingual glands, which are salivary glands. So they would activate salivary glands. The third cranial nerve that is going to transmit parasympathetic nervous system information is going to be the glossopharyngeal nerve. And the glossopharyngeal nerve synapses in what's called the otic ganglion, and the postganglionic fiber then runs to the parotid gland. Okay, and this is also a salivary gland. All right. The vagus nerve is arguably the most important carrier of parasympathetic information, because it is going to account for about 90% of all the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers in the body. Right, so you can see all of these different fibers are coming from the vagus nerve. So they're arising from the medulla. They are going on to synapse in their terminal ganglia, which are going to be in the walls of the target organs. So here you can see, I'll draw this out. This will be a great visual for looking at. Here is a terminal ganglion on the heart, terminal ganglion on the lung. We have two terminal ganglia, one on the liver and one on the gallbladder. A terminal ganglion on the stomach, on the pancreas, on several areas of the colon, and also the small intestine. So the the targets here. So these preganglionic fibers coming from the vagus nerve that are synapsing onto the postganglionic fibers on the heart. This is, in terms of the heart, it's going to, the mass effect that's going to happen here is actually going to decrease heart rate. Okay. In terms of the pulmonary plexus, and that would be this region where the lungs are, it's going to, oops, sorry about that. I was gonna say, we say constrict lungs, but not necessarily constrict them, but not blow them wide open. Okay, so it's kind of maintaining a normal tone of our lungs just for normal breathing. The esophageal plexus and the anterior and the posterior vagal trunks, this is going to go on to innervate the stomach, liver, gallbladder, the pancreas, the small intestine, and the first part of the large intestine. So whenever food moves through the intestines, it goes from the stomach into the small intestine, and then from the small intestine, food's gonna pass through this way. Till it leaves the body. And so what we can see then here is that we have postganglionic fibers just on this first part of the large intestine and the small intestine. Okay. So that kind of takes care of the cranial part of the parasympathetic division. And now let's talk about the sacral part of the parasympathetic division. So this is going to originate from neurons that are located in the S2 to S4 regions of the spinal cord. And the purpose of the sacral part of the parasympathetic division is going to be to serve our pelvic organs and also the distal half of the large intestine. Okay, so that's what you see. Here we would have a terminal ganglia in those two regions. Here would be our terminal ganglia on the bladder and the ureters, and then also on various genitalia. So we're going to have all of these structures being served by the sacral part of the parasympathetic division. Okay. So now that we know sort of the anatomy and where these different fibers are going, let's talk a little bit more about the functions of the parasympathetic division. And I've already started to mention these, but let's continue on with them a little bit more. The parasympathetic division is what normally dominates the heart and the smooth muscle of the digestive and urinary tract organs. And so in terms of the heart, it is going to, oops, my apologies. It's going to slow the heart down. Okay, so we're going to slow the heart down. It's also going to dictate our normal activity in our digestive and urinary systems. So it's going to stimulate digestion. It's also going to contract the bladder so that we can urinate whenever we are in a more comfortable resting type of situation. Just a heads up, there are ways that this system can be overridden. And so this system can actually be overridden during times of stress, which will activate the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system will actually override these sort of normal activities that are performed by our parasympathetic division. In addition, we do have some drugs that can block the parasympathetic responses, and thus can increase heart rate and also block fecal and urinary retention. Finally, the parasympathetic fibers are responsible for activating most glands except, and this is quite important, except the adrenal glands and the sweat glands of the skin. Okay, so parasympathetic fibers do most of the glands except adrenal glands and sweat glands, because those are actually, that's the job of the sympathetic division, is to innervate the adrenal and the sweat glands. So let's talk now about the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division itself is more complex, and it innervates many more organs than what the parasympathetic division does. Some structures in the body are innervated only by the sympathetic division, which I've mentioned to you guys before. For example, the sweat glands, the erector pili muscles of the hair follicles, which, remember, those ones are the muscles that give us goosebumps. And also the smooth muscle of the blood vessels. So blood vessels have a layer of muscle around them. It's smooth muscle so that it can constrict or make the vessels smaller or make the vessels bigger and dilate if necessary. And those things are all controlled only by the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic division is sometimes also called the thoracolumbar division, and this just refers to the fact that the preganglionic neurons are in the spinal cord segments T1 to L2 approximately. So this would be spinal segment L2, spinal segment T1. And remember that whenever we were looking at the spinal cord in the central nervous system lecture, we talked about when you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you have the dorsal horns, the ventral horns, and then you have those lateral horns. And so I'll just do like a quick little drawing just to refresh our memory. So remember, in the thoracic and in some of the lumbar regions of the spinal cord, so this is a spinal cord cross section. If this is the posterior, oops, my apologies again. If this is the posterior side and this is the anterior side, so this is the dorsal horn, the ventral horn, and then these guys out here are the lateral horns. Remember, only present in the thoracic and the first couple of lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So this is going to be the region where the preganglionic fibers, so where these darker green fibers are going to originate. They're going to come out of the spinal cord with the motor fibers on the ventral side. So they're going to come out the ventral root. Okay, so here's where we're going to talk about that a little bit more, and here's a better picture than what I can draw for you. But the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are, again, located in this lateral horn of the spinal cord. Right, so just to highlight that, lateral horn of the spinal cord, be there and there. Okay, the postganglionic neuron cell bodies are going to be located in what we call the sympathetic trunk ganglion, okay? We have 23 sympathetic trunk ganglion within the sympathetic trunk as a whole. So the sympathetic trunk would be this long chain that's going up and down the thoracic and lumbar regions. And we have 23 of these ganglia along the way. And the ganglia are just sort of the bulges in this trunk. And so if you're looking at it from the side, it might look like something like this. Okay, so each of these would be a ganglia. And the whole thing is called the trunk. Okay, so we have 3 cervical ganglion. We're going to have 11 thoracic ganglion. We're going to have 4 lumbar ganglion, 4 sacral ganglion. Just for final purposes, we're going to have 1 coccygeal ganglion. Okay, these ganglion and what I'm drawing for you is similar to what we have here with the bulge being the ganglion. Okay, so the ganglion themselves are actually highly variable. They vary in size, they vary in position, and they vary in number, as I just went through the number difference among the different areas of the spinal cord. So, and also just keep in mind that we have them on both sides of the spinal cord. Okay, so there's one on the left side and then there's one on the right side. So let's talk about how these ganglia work and how we are sort of handing off our baton in this relay race for the sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to have these really short myelinated preganglionic fibers. Okay, so we're going to start right here with these green fibers, preganglionic neurons. They are going to exit the spinal cord through our ventral root, which now they're going through the spinal nerve, right? Because the spinal nerve is just our ventral and our dorsal root put together. So now these fibers are traveling through the spinal nerve, where they are going to enter what's called the white ramus communicantes. Okay, and again, this is only in the thoracic and lumbar and first lumbar regions. So we're going to enter, preganglionic fibers are going to enter the white ramus of the rami communicantes, or also called the communicating rami. And then they're going to follow one of 3 pathways. Okay, so pathway, you have them labeled here, either pathway 1, where they synapse in the same ganglion that they entered. Option 2 is they're going to travel up the chain or down the chain and synapse in a different ganglion. Or option 3 is they're going to leave, they're going to continue on and leave the chain through what's called a splanchnic nerve and go on and synapse somewhere else. These are kind of rare situations. But if, say, we are going to stay in this chain, our preganglionic fibers are going to synapse onto our postganglionic fibers, which are the ones that you see here in red. And these postganglionic fibers are going to leave the chain out the gray ramus and go out the remainder of the nerve fiber, whether that be going to the sweat glands or salivary glands or liver or skeletal muscle or so on. These postganglionic fibers, they're going to go on to innervate their target pathway, to innervate whatever their target is via pathways to either the head, the thorax, the abdomen, or pelvis. So we're going to talk about pathways that they take to get to the head, pathways that they would take to get to the thorax, pathways they might take to get to the abdomen, and pathways that they might take to get to the pelvis. But first, we're going to talk about the 3 pathways that they might follow, which I sort of mentioned here. All right, so let's talk about these 3 pathways that they might take, which I already mentioned them once in the last slide, so I'm going to hopefully just kind of drill this in for you guys to make it a little bit easier to understand. So after the preganglionic fiber enters the trunk ganglion through our white ramus, they will either 1, synapse with their postganglionic neuron in that same ganglion. Okay, so that's what you see happening here. And then the postganglionic fiber will go and join the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve and go on to, we'll say in this case, we're going to innervate the erector pili muscles and the sweat glands of the skin. All right, so that's option number 1. The other thing that the preganglionic fiber can do is that it can enter at one level, so we still entered, but instead of synapsing in that same ganglion, it might decide to move up the chain and synapse in a different ganglion. Or contrarily, it might decide to move down the chain and synapse in a different ganglion down here. Okay, so in this example, we're moving up the chain. We're synapsing in a different ganglion on the postganglionic fiber. The postganglionic fiber then exits the chain through this gray ramus communicantes, goes out through the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve, and goes on to innervate its target structure. And we're in this second example, it is giving us the example of the smooth muscle of the blood vessels. Okay, that's the effector that we're going for here. Okay, the third option that the preganglionic fiber can take is that it can still come out of the spinal cord, go through the spinal nerve, enter the chain by going through this white ramus, and now it's in its ganglion, but it has another pathway to exit. It can actually exit through what's called a splanchnic nerve. And the splanchnic nerve will send that preganglionic fiber to what is called a collateral ganglion. And the collateral ganglion is where the preganglionic fiber is going to synapse on the postganglionic fiber. And that postganglionic fiber will then go on to innervate its designated effector. And most of this sort of situation would be for innervating things like the smooth muscle and the glands and the abdominal organs, okay? So like the intestines and so on. These splanchnic nerves serve the intestines and other abdominal organs, okay? So, excuse me. Remember I said that we're going to talk about the pathways that the preganglionic fibers can take, and then we're going to talk about different pathways to get to different areas of the body that the postganglionic fibers are going to take. And so first let's talk about some pathways that we can take to get to the structures on the head. And by we, I mean the sympathetic fibers. Sympathetic fibers can take the following pathway to get to the head. So these fibers are going to emerge from T1 to T4. So I'm going to draw those out as we go along. Okay, so we're going to have T1, 2, 3, or 4. and they are going to come out and enter our sympathetic trunk chain ganglia. These particular fibers are actually going to travel upwards and go on into what's called the superior cervical ganglion, where they are going to synapse on their postganglionic fibers. And then these particular fibers are going to go on to innervate some different things. So things like this postganglionic fiber is going to go on to innervate the skin and perhaps the blood vessels of the head. Also, maybe we're going to have this postganglionic fiber traveling up and innervating the eye, maybe the lacrimal glands and the nasal mucosa, the nasal glands, to stimulate the dilator muscles of the iris. So this is going to make our pupils bigger. Which is good because if we're in sympathetic nervous system, we want to be able to see better. So in terms of innervating the skin and the blood vessels of the head, this is good because if we are running for our life, we can sweat. And our brain gets oxygen. We are inhibiting our nasal and salivary glands, which makes our saliva thick. Also, we are going to have fibers that innervate the smooth muscle of the upper eyelid, which is good for keeping our eyes open. And these fibers, so we covered those three. The fourth one here actually has a branch. It's going to go to the heart. Okay, just one of these branches is going to go to the heart. Okay. All right, so that takes care of those. This is our pathway to the head. But we're not finished there. We are next going to talk about pathways to the thorax. So for pathways to the thorax, I'm going to just get out a different color here and start drawing. These preganglionic fibers are coming from T1 to T6. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay. These fibers are going to synapse onto their postganglionic fibers in the middle and inferior cervical ganglion. Okay, so we're going to have some go here and here. Okay. Now the postganglionic fibers actually are going to innervate, actually they should say they're going to go on and enter the spinal nerves C4 to C8. And so that's kind of what you see happening where they are sort of coming together. And the effectors of these particular fibers are going to be the heart, so we're going to increase heart rate, the thyroid gland, purpose here, energy, the skin, the purpose of this particular effect would be additionally, when it comes to the lungs, we're going to airways. And also it will innervate the esophagus. Okay. Next, we'll talk about sympathetic pathways to the abdominal region. These ones are going to emerge from T5 through L2. So all of these guys are all going to the abdomen. Their synapses are going to be occurring in celiac and in superior mesenteric ganglia. So some of these fibers are going to travel upwards, some of them downwards. Go on to this superior ganglions. Or these splanchnic nerves as well. Okay, so here we have the celiac ganglion, a branch coming off of there doing the mesenteric ganglion, and then this bottom one would be a splanchnic nerve as well. But virtually the post I should redraw this. Okay, apologies here. All of these ones are going to celiac ganglion and superior mesenteric ganglion. This is going to go on to serve the stomach, the intestines, liver, gallbladder, spleen, adrenal medulla, and kidney. Okay. And basically, for most of these things, so for these things, this is going to inhibit digestion whenever sympathetic nervous system is activated. For the kidneys, this is going to inhibit urine formation, so you don't have to stop and take a pee break when you're running for your life. For the adrenal medulla, this actually releases adrenaline, which is epinephrine. And spleen is good for recycling red blood cells. Just going to be important if you are using all the oxygen carrying capacities of your red blood cells. Okay. Finally, the pathway to the pelvis, the last part of the sympathetic pathways. Let me just get the stuff up here, apologies. So in terms of the sympathetic pathways that are going to go down to the pelvis, the preganglionic fibers are going to come from T10 to L2. And these are going to travel to the lumbar and sacral ganglia. So you'll see some of them coming down this way and some coming this way. Some of these fibers are going to synapse with postganglionic fibers that run in these splanchnic nerves, which I just drew for you there. So in order to better see that, I should fix that a little bit. So we see synapsing in the sacral splanchnic. It's also going to be synapsing in the lumbar splanchnic after traveling through lumbar splanchnic nerves. Others are going to pass directly to plexuses, from plexuses to collateral ganglion. And the postganglionic fibers here are going to serve the distal half of the large intestine. All right, so this last part of the large intestine, also the rectum, the bladder, and the reproductive organs. And in the sympathetic pathway, the postganglionic fibers for going to from the pathway to the pelvis are going to mostly just have an inhibitory effect on the muscles and the glands in these abdominopelvic visceral organs. So inhibit sex drive, inhibit urination, and inhibit defecation. All right, so this is basically everything I've already told you guys, but the sympathetic division functions are to, first and foremost, basically keep our fight or flight reaction. So dilating the pupils, inhibiting salivation, speeding up the heart, helping you to breathe, inhibiting digestion, releasing glucose for energy, secreting adrenaline, relaxing the bladder to prevent you from having to urinate, and inhibiting your sex organs. But a very important thing that I haven't talked to you guys yet about is the fact that the sympathetic division is what is controlling the blood pressure, even at rest. And it does this through what's called the sympathetic tone, also called the vasomotor tone, which keeps the blood vessels in a continual state of partial constriction. And this is important to maintain blood pressure. And blood pressure just refers to the force of our blood cells pushing against the walls of our blood vessels. And so if you had these big, huge, wide blood vessels all the time, there you wouldn't have any pressure and nothing would ever really move through those vessels. And so by keeping them slightly constricted, and by they, I mean keeping the blood vessels slightly constricted, this allows blood to continually be pumped throughout the system. And that's the job of the sympathetic division. So the sympathetic fibers kind of help do this by firing more rapidly to constrict the blood vessels, and thus causing the blood pressure to rise. And compared with the parasympathetic fibers, which are firing a little bit less rapidly to prompt vessels to dilate and decrease the pressure. So the sympathetic fibers are firing a little bit more frequently than what the parasympathetic fibers are, which keeps our blood vessels slightly constricted at all times. So some very unique roles of the sympathetic division that we don't really have with the parasympathetic division are the roles on the adrenal medulla, sweat glands, erector pili muscles, kidneys, and most blood vessels. These are areas that receive only sympathetic fibers. And so the sympathetic division is what controls our thermoregulatory responses. So responses to heat through sweating. Also helps to control the release of renin from the kidneys, which goes on and eventually increases our blood pressure. And it does this because it retains fluid and also prevents urination. And then it also has some metabolic effects, like increasing the metabolic rate of cells, because when we're in fight or flight mode, we burn more energy. Also raising the blood glucose levels, which we need for making energy, and mobilizing fats to use as fuel. So breaking down fat cells and getting the good stuff out of those fat cells and creating energy with it.